Kevin stopped by the shop one evening about a year after the trial ended. He brought pizza and beer, and we sat in my small office going over how much had changed. He'd been there from the beginning, helped me open that container, witnessed the chaos that followed. Now he was looking around at the bustling garage I'd built, shaking his head in disbelief. "You know what's crazy?" he said, taking a bite of pepperoni. "A year ago, you were just another mechanic at Davidson's, getting paid barely above minimum wage, dealing with Jerry's nonsense every single day. Now look at you, boss of your own place, employee of the month every month because you're the only boss." I laughed. Jerry Davidson had been my previous employer, a man who'd made every day at work a special kind of misery. He'd constantly questioned my abilities because I was a woman, paid me less than my male coworkers, and took credit for my ideas whenever something went well. When I gave my notice after buying the container and finding all that inventory, he'd actually laughed at me. "You'll be back begging for your job in 3 months," he'd said. "You don't have what it takes to run a business." That memory still stung, but it also fueled me. I'd proven him wrong in every possible way. My shop had better reviews, faster turnaround times, and happier customers than Davidson's ever had. In fact, I'd heard through the grapevine that Jerry was struggling to keep staff. Apparently, being a terrible boss catches up with you eventually. "I saw Jerry last week at the parts supplier," Kevin continued. "He asked about you, tried to act like he was just being friendly, but I could tell he was fishing for information, wanted to know if you were still in business." "What did you tell him?" "That you're doing better than ever, that you just hired 2 more employees and expanded into the bay next door." His face went red, and he walked away without another word. I smiled at that. It wasn't about gloating, not really. It was about validation. All those years of being told I wasn't good enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't smart enough, and here I was, thriving. But success had brought its own challenges. About 6 weeks after Kevin's visit, I got a call from Patricia Vance, the lawyer who'd helped with the Callaway case. She sounded concerned. "Morgan, we need to talk. Something's come up regarding the container and the inventory." My stomach dropped. "What kind of something?" "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? It's better if we discuss this in person." I barely slept that night. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Had I done something wrong? Was there some legal issue with how I distributed the inventory? Was Callaway appealing his conviction? By the time I arrived at Patricia's office the next morning, I was exhausted and anxious. Patricia gestured for me to sit. Her desk was covered with documents, and she looked like she'd been working through the night. "Okay, so here's the situation. Richard Callaway's ex-wife has filed a civil suit. She's claiming that the inventory you found was marital property and that she's entitled to a portion of its value." I stared at her. "You're kidding." "I wish I was. Her name is Diane Callaway, and according to her lawyer, she had no knowledge of Richard's fraud. She claims she was a victim too, that when he disappeared, he left her with nothing. Now that the inventory has been found and distributed, she wants compensation." "But I bought that container legally, at a legitimate auction. How can she claim it's hers?" Patricia leaned back in her chair. "That's the argument we're going to make. But her lawyer is claiming that the container was purchased with funds from Richard's fraudulent activities, which means it was never legally his to abandon. They're arguing that as his spouse at the time, Diane has a claim to the assets." This is insane. Does she know what her husband did, how many people he hurt? She claims she didn't. And honestly, Morgan, she might be telling the truth. Spouses can be kept in the dark about financial crimes, but that doesn't change the fact that she's coming after you for this. I felt the anger rising in my chest. I'd done everything right. I'd returned stolen property to the people it was taken from. I'd helped bring a criminal to justice. And now I was being sued by his ex-wife for doing the right thing. Diane Callaway's lawsuit demanded $200,000 in damages. According to her calculations, That was her share of the inventory's value after accounting for what I'd returned to the original suppliers and what I'd kept for myself. The number was staggering, and I didn't have that kind of money. Everything I had was tied up in the shop, in equipment and inventory and operating costs. Patricia filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Diane had no legal standing to claim property that had been legally auctioned and sold. But the judge denied the motion, saying that the case had enough merit to proceed to trial. That meant months of legal battles, mounting attorney fees, and the constant stress of wondering if I was going to lose everything I'd built. I started having nightmares. In them, I'd be back at that industrial yard, opening the container again, but this time it was empty except for a note that said, "You should have left it alone." I'd wake up in a cold sweat, checking my phone for messages from Patricia, terrified that there was more bad news. The legal process was slow and brutal. Diane's lawyer, a slick guy named Brandon Mills, was aggressive and relentless. He painted me as someone who'd profited from stolen goods, conveniently leaving out the part where I'd returned thousands of dollars worth of inventory to the people Richard had defrauded. He made it sound like I'd found a treasure chest and kept it all for myself, which was so far from the truth it made me sick. During depositions, I had to relive every moment of finding the container, cataloging the contents, tracking down the victims, working with Patricia to bring Richard to justice. Brandon twisted everything I said, trying to make me look greedy or opportunistic. Patricia did her best to object and redirect, but it was exhausting. The worst part was the public attention. The local news picked up the story. Mechanic sued by fraudster's ex-wife over shipping container fortune, read one headline. The comment sections were brutal. Half the people supported me, praising what I'd done to help Richard's victims. The other half called me a thief, said I should have turned everything over to the police immediately, claimed I was no better than Richard himself. I tried to keep the shop running normally, but it was hard to focus. My employees, Rachel and Brianna, both young mechanics I'd hired and trained, could tell something was wrong. I finally sat them down and explained the situation. They were furious on my behalf. "That's completely unfair," Rachel said. "You helped people, you did the right thing, and now you're being punished for it." "Welcome to the legal system," I said bitterly. Brianna, who was quieter but just as sharp, asked, "What happens if you lose? What happens to the shop?" I didn't want to answer that, but they deserved honesty. If I lose and have to pay $200,000, I'll probably have to sell the shop, liquidate everything, and even then I might not have enough to cover it. I'd be bankrupt. The room went silent. Rachel and Brianna exchanged looks, and I could see the worry in their eyes. They'd taken a chance on working for a new shop, for a boss who believed in them. Now that might all disappear. "We're not going to let that happen," Rachel said firmly. "What can we do to help?" I appreciated the sentiment, but what could they do? This was a legal battle, not something we could fix with wrenches and determination. Still, their loyalty meant everything to me. As the trial date approached, Patricia and I prepared our defense. We gathered testimonies from Tom Jennings and the other suppliers I'd helped. We compiled evidence of how I'd used the inventory, showing that I'd acted ethically and legally. We had character witnesses, financial records, everything we could think of to prove that Diane's claim was baseless. But Brandon Mills had his own strategy. He tracked down people who'd bought parts from me, people who'd visited the shop, and he tried to paint a picture of me as someone who'd built a business empire on stolen goods. He inflated the value of everything I'd kept, making it sound like I was sitting on a fortune, when in reality I was barely breaking even most months. The trial began on a gray Monday morning in October. The courthouse was old and imposing, with high ceilings and wooden benches that creaked when you sat down. Diane Calloway was there with Brandon Mills, looking like the picture of a wronged woman in a conservative dress and minimal makeup. She avoided eye contact with me. The prosecution went first. Brandon laid out Diane's case. She was an innocent victim of her ex-husband's crimes, left with nothing when he disappeared. When the stolen inventory was recovered, she had a legal right to a portion of its value as marital property. He showed financial documents proving that she'd struggled financially after Richard left, that she'd lost their home, that she'd had to rebuild her life from scratch. It was effective. I could see some of the jurors nodding sympathetically. Diane even cried at one point, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue while describing how Richard had abandoned her. Part of me felt bad for her. She probably had been a victim in some ways, but that didn't give her the right to come after me for doing the right thing. Then it was our turn. Patricia called me to the stand first. She walked me through everything: buying the container, discovering the contents, finding the documents, tracking down the victims, working with law enforcement. She asked me to explain why I'd returned so much of the inventory instead of keeping it all. Because it wasn't mine, I said simply. Those people had already lost so much because of Richard Calloway. If I could give them back even a fraction of what was taken from them, I had to do it. It was the right thing to do. And did you profit from keeping the remaining inventory? I used it to start my business, yes, but profit? Barely. Most of what I kept went into equipment, rent, payroll, operating costs. I'm not rich. I'm just trying to build something honest. Brandon Mills cross-examined me aggressively, trying to poke holes in my story, suggesting I'd kept more than I'd admitted, implying I'd known the container was valuable when I bought it. But I held my ground. I told the truth, simply and clearly, and I could see that some of the jurors were on my side. Patricia called Tom Jennings next. He was nervous on the stand, but his testimony was powerful. He described how Richard's fraud had destroyed his business and his life, and how I'd reached out to him and returned parts that rightfully belonged to him. Morgan Webb gave me back my dignity, he said, his voice shaking. She didn't have to do that. She could have kept everything and no one would have known. But she chose to do the right thing, and that's more than I can say for most people. Brandon tried to discredit Tom, suggesting he had a bias because I'd given him free inventory. But Tom didn't back down. She gave me back what Richard Calloway stole from me. That's not bias, that's justice. We called 2 more suppliers who told similar stories. We called the detective who'd worked on Richard's case, who confirmed that the documents I'd found had been crucial to the prosecution. We even called the auctioneer Dale, who testified that the sale of the container was completely legitimate and that I'd had no way of knowing what was inside. By the end of the week, I felt cautiously optimistic. Our case was strong, but I knew better than to celebrate too early. Diane took the stand on the second Monday. She was a good witness, poised and sympathetic. She talked about her marriage to Richard, how charming he'd been at first, how she'd trusted him completely. She claimed she'd had no idea about the fraud until he disappeared and the creditors started calling. She described the humiliation of losing her home, of having her bank accounts frozen, of being associated with a criminal. I lost everything because of what Richard did, she said, tears streaming down her face. And now I find out that there was all this inventory, all these assets that could have helped me, and someone else has it. Someone else is building a life with what should have been mine. It was a compelling performance, and I could see it affecting the jury. Brandon Mills' closing argument focused on the law. He argued that regardless of my intentions, regardless of what I'd done with the inventory, the fact remained that it was marital property acquired during Diane's marriage to Richard. Under state law, she was entitled to a portion of its value. He calculated that value at $400,000 total, and he demanded that I pay Diane half. Patricia's closing argument focused on justice and morality. She reminded the jury that I'd bought the container legally, that I'd worked to make things right for Richard's victims, that I'd helped bring a criminal to justice. She argued that Diane's claim was an attempt to profit from her ex-husband's crimes, and that rewarding her would be a slap in the face to everyone Richard had hurt. Morgan Webb did everything right, Patricia said, her voice ringing through the courtroom. She saw an opportunity and took it, yes, But when she discovered that opportunity was built on someone else's suffering, she didn't look the other way. She didn't keep quiet. She acted with integrity and compassion. And now she's being punished for it. That's not justice. That's not what our legal system is supposed to do. The jury deliberated for 2 days, 2 of the longest days of my life. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could barely function. Rachel and Brianna kept the shop running while I sat in my apartment, staring at my phone, waiting for Patricia's call. When it finally came, I almost didn't answer. I was terrified of what she'd say, but I forced myself to pick up. "We won," Patricia said, and I heard the relief in her voice. "The jury found in your favor on all counts. Diane's claim was dismissed." I started crying. I couldn't help it. The relief was overwhelming. The jury's decision was based on several factors. First, they agreed that the auction had been legitimate and that I'd acquired the container legally. Second, they found that my actions in returning stolen property to the original victims demonstrated good faith and ethical behavior. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they ruled that Diane couldn't claim ownership of property acquired through fraud, even if she'd been unaware of the fraud at the time. Brandon Mills filed an appeal, but Patricia was confident it would be rejected. The case law was on our side, and the jury's decision had been clear and well-reasoned. The news coverage of the verdict was much kinder to me than the coverage during the trial had been. "Mechanic vindicated in container lawsuit," read one headline. "Good deed goes unpunished," read another. People who'd criticized me before were suddenly praising me. It was whiplash-inducing, but I tried not to pay too much attention. I'd learned that public opinion was fickle and ultimately meaningless. What mattered was that I could keep my shop, keep building my business, keep moving forward. Rachel and Brianna were ecstatic. We celebrated with champagne in the shop after hours, toasting to justice and persistence and not letting the world grind you down. Tom Jennings called to congratulate me. So did the other suppliers I'd helped. Even the detective who'd worked on Richard's case reached out to say he was glad things had worked out. It felt good to be vindicated, to have people recognize that I'd done the right thing even when it would have been easier not to. But the experience had changed me. I was more cautious now, more aware of how quickly things could fall apart. I'd come so close to losing everything, and that fear lingered even after the trial was over. 6 months after the trial ended, I got an unexpected visitor at the shop. It was a woman in her early 30s, professionally dressed, with a kind face and nervous energy. She introduced herself as Lauren Mitchell, and she asked if we could talk privately. We went to my office, and Lauren explained why she was there. She'd been following my story in the news, and something about it had resonated with her. She worked as an accountant for a mid-sized construction company, and recently she discovered some irregularities in the books. Nothing as dramatic as what Richard Calloway had done, but still concerning. Her boss was inflating expenses and skimming money from projects, and when Lauren had tried to bring it up internally, she'd been shut down and threatened with termination. "I don't know what to do," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "If I report him, I'll lose my job. But if I don't, I'm complicit in fraud. I saw what you did, how you stood up for what was right even when it was hard, and I thought maybe you could give me advice." I listened to her story, my heart aching for her. I knew exactly what she was feeling, that awful weight of knowing something wrong is happening and having to decide whether to speak up. I told her about Patricia Vance, gave her the lawyer's contact information, and encouraged her to document everything she'd found. "It won't be easy," I warned her. "Standing up to people in power never is, but you'll be able to live with yourself afterward, and that matters more than any job." Lauren thanked me, her eyes filled with tears, and left. I never found out what she decided to do, but I hope she found the courage to do the right thing. That conversation made me realize something. The container, Richard Calloway, the trial with Diane, all of it had given me more than just a business. It had given me a purpose beyond fixing cars and paying bills. I'd become someone people looked to as an example, someone who'd proven that integrity and success weren't mutually exclusive. As my second year in business approached, I started thinking about expansion. The shop was doing well, better than I'd ever imagined. We had regular customers, great reviews, and more work than we could handle. Rachel and Brianna had both grown tremendously as mechanics, and I'd hired a third employee, a young guy named Marcus who reminded me of myself at that age, hungry to learn and willing to work hard. But expansion meant risk. It meant loans and more overhead and the possibility of failure. After everything I'd been through, the thought of taking on that kind of risk was terrifying. I'd almost lost everything once. Did I really want to put myself in that position again? I talked it over with Kevin one night. He'd left Davidson's too by then, sick of Jerry's treatment, and was working at a dealership across town. We met for drinks, and I laid out my dilemma. "You're afraid," he said simply, "and that's okay. What you went through would make anyone gun-shy. But here's the thing, Morgan, you're good at this. Not just the mechanic stuff, but the business stuff. You know how to treat people right, how to build something solid. If you don't expand, you're going to regret it. What if I fail? What if I take out loans and the market shifts and I can't make the payments? What if I end up losing everything anyway?" Kevin shrugged. "Then you fail. You're not afraid of hard work. You'd rebuild. But I don't think you're going to fail. I think you're going to crush it, and in 5 years you'll be running the biggest independent auto shop in the state." His confidence in me was both comforting and terrifying. But he was right about one thing. I didn't want to live my life afraid of what might go wrong. I'd already proven I could handle adversity. Maybe it was time to trust myself and take the leap. I spent the next few months developing a business plan, meeting with lenders, scouting locations for a second shop. It was exhausting but exhilarating. I felt like I was building something real, something lasting. The second location opened 18 months after the trial ended. It was in a neighboring town, a slightly larger space with more bays and better equipment. I hired 4 more employees, including a service manager, so I wouldn't have to split my time between both locations constantly. The opening day was chaotic and stressful and absolutely perfect. Tom Jennings came to the ribbon cutting. So did several of my regular customers and a few people from the community who'd followed my story. There was even a small article in the local paper about the expansion. From shipping container to success, Webb's Auto Repair continues to grow. Standing there in my second shop, surrounded by people who believed in me, I thought back to that day at the auction. The day I'd raised my paddle and bought a rusted container for $300. If someone had told me then where that decision would lead, I never would have believed them. But here I was, not just surviving but thriving, building something meaningful, helping people, living proof that sometimes taking a chance, doing the right thing, and refusing to give up can actually work out. Richard Calloway was still in prison. Diane had dropped her appeal and disappeared from public view. The suppliers I'd helped were back on their feet. And I had 2 shops, 7 employees, and a future that looked brighter than anything I dared to imagine. Life wasn't perfect. I still worked 70-hour weeks. I still dealt with difficult customers and broken equipment and all the headaches that come with running a business. But it was mine, built on a foundation of integrity and hard work, and no one could take that away from me. Sometimes I still thought about that container, about what might have been inside if Richard Calloway had made different choices. But mostly I was just grateful. Grateful for the chance, grateful for the challenge, grateful for the opportunity to prove that doing the right thing isn't just morally correct. Sometimes it's the smartest business decision you can make.